Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So we'll begin shortly. In the meantime, if you could write in the chat box your name and where you're joining from, selecting the option panelists and attendees. We'll give a couple of seconds more for people joining in. In the meantime, if you could let us know where you are joining from and your name, please, in the chat box. And if you could select panelists and attendees option. A very warm welcome, everyone. Today marks our 6th event as part of the CMS InTouch PDW series on publishing critical work. And the series is part of the mission of the CMS InTouch to connect, support, and nurture the international CMS community. The series comprises interactive developmental online events for those interested in learning how to publish critical work in different outlets. And it's our sheer pleasure today to have the editorial team of the Journal of Business Ethics with us today. The Journal of Business Ethics is committed to improving the human condition through dialogues on ethical issues related to business. And it has a unique structure in terms of having section editors, some of whom are here today with us. I have a personal and emotional bond with the journal, as I was fortunate to have my first paper based on my thesis published in JBE during my PhD. I'm sure we all are excited to hear the brilliant team of the JBE today. And it's going to be a very interactive session between the panelists. They are going to do discussion amongst themselves first, and then they invite all of us to participate through Q&A. So you may ask your question at any point in time during the session, but please make sure that you type your question in the Q&A function. There are two ways in which you can participate. One is the Q&A function and the other one is the chat. We would appreciate if you put your questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom. If you look on your screen, there are two ways in which you can participate. So please use Q&A while posing your questions or comments to the panel. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the fantastic team today, the editors-in-chief of the JBE, Michelle and Gazi, and the section editors, Premilla, Charlotte, Suhaib, and Sara. A very warm welcome, everyone. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely welcome. We're really thrilled to be here today. It is just terrific to be able to talk about Journal of Business Ethics to an interested audience and to a critical audience. I'm going to start off actually by sharing some slides for about 10 minutes. I'm going to just introduce some of the features of the journal that I think are very particularly relevant. I really don't want to speak for too long because we'd like to open to the whole panel. And so I will only have just a few slides, but if you could just bear with me while I share my screen. Okay, you can see my slides now? Terrific, okay, excellent. So again, I'd like to really just thank CMS InTouch webinars and seminars for organising this, workshop on publishing critical work in Journal of Business Ethics. We're very committed to a very broad range of scholarship, but particularly committed to publishing critical work that focuses on business and ethics in the journal. I'd like to start off with by just talking a little bit, as I said, about the journal generally. Very, very pleased to have some terrific members of the editorial team here today. I've been the editor-in-chief of the journal since 2016 and was absolutely thrilled when Gazi accepted the invitation to join me as co-editor this year in 2021. It's been an absolute pleasure working with Gazi, and if you've got an interest in the direction that we're taking editorially, we did publish an editorial looking at reinvigorating the social aspect and the societal aspect of business ethics in the first issue in February this year. Also with us today are several of our incredible team of editors. So we have with us, and they will introduce themselves, I think, when we start with the open panel, but Charlotte Karam from American University of Beirut, Premilla D'Cruz from the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, Louise Muhr from Copenhagen Business School, and Suhaib Riaz from University of Ottawa. I think that we've already heard a little bit about the focus of the journal from the introduction, but I think it bears saying that the focus of the journal, and in fact, much of what we say about the scope and aim of the journal, dates back to the founding editor, Alex Mikolos, who in 1982 had the wherewithal and the forethought to start this journal in the area of business ethics. And at that time, he wrote that from its inception, that the journal has aimed to improve the human condition by providing a public forum for discussion and a debate of ethical issues related to business. And importantly, we see the journal as an open channel of communication that will allow people with diverse views, opinions, knowledge, insight, prescriptions and proscriptions to make their case, allowing any other side to respond. So very much a vehicle for dialogue and debate, not just for more traditional scholarship. To begin with, I'm going to characterize the journal in three different ways. The first characterization, the first very strong characteristics of the journal is that it is big. And if you've ever heard of the idea that perhaps the Journal of Business Ethics publishes a lot of issues per year, has a lot of submissions per year, has a large editorial team, you would be right. We publish 28 issues a year. This is not a quarterly, it's not even a sextet or whatever the correct term would be. Last year, we topped 3,000 submissions for the year. We don't expect this year we will have quite that many, but we will get close to 3,000. We publish 300 or so papers per year. We have 33 different sections, and we'll talk about those sections in a couple of minutes. And we have 58 editors from 15 different countries. So the editors who are with us today are handpicked for your benefit, because we thought that they would be the editors with whom you would have most interest. But we have a terrific team of experts that range from finance to economics to critical theory to organization behavior. And I really do encourage you to look at the website and have a look at the sections. The journal isn't just big, it's also very broad. And this was a real point that we made when we came in as editors-in-chief in 2016, only the second editor-in-chief after Alex Mikolos, Ed Freeman and myself, thought that we wanted to do two things with the journal. One was to recenter it with regard to the ethics component of business, but the other was to open it in terms of disciplinary areas. And if I could just give you an indication about the breadth, commitment to the breadth of the journal, we publish original articles from a wide variety of methodologies and disciplinary perspectives concerning ethical issues related to business that can bring something new or unique to the discourse in their field. So again, just emphasising the breadth of the disciplinary areas that we reach to, and also the interdisciplinary work that we publish as well. I mentioned earlier that we've got many sections. We have a relatively new website, and as websites go, it's pretty difficult to use. One of the things that's quite difficult to find is the actual description of the sections and the section editors. So I've got a little lead in here, as you can see. If you go to the journal home, you go to journal updates, and there you will find a list of the 33 sections, starting with A for accounting and ending up with T for technology. We're yet to have a section that starts with Z, but if anybody can think of an appropriate one, please let us know. I'm sure that we would be open to it, because really we're just very open to lots of ideas. I really encourage you to look at the section and section descriptions. You will see that there is, as I said, a very broad range of sections, and that they are, in some cases, very carefully constructed sections in order to really give you an indication of the direction that your work can go and the suitability of a section that you would be submitting to. And this is a very important point that I would like to make. It's very unusual at our journal because of the size of the journal, and there are a number of unusual features of the journal because of its size, but this one's particularly important for people who are thinking of submitting to the journal, particularly for the first time, is to know that you submit, as author at submission, you select the section that the paper will be at least first directed towards. And so matching your work to the section and the section editors is very important. Now, I say that the paper will be initially directed towards that section, and that is because internally we have a transfer system that if you select an editor or a section and the editor believes that they are not in the best position to handle that paper, whether that's because of a mismatch with the section or for other reasons such as conflict of interest or the like, then they will use an internal transfer. But the internal transfers are not as common as you would think, and so you will most likely end up with the section that you select. Here is a list of the selection of the sections. I resisted the idea of highlighting any in particular on the slide, but I would draw your attention to, obviously, that we have a critical studies and business ethics section, but we also have a feminism section, a global issues section, we have a sociology and business ethics section, so and many sort of areas of business and disciplinary areas such as philosophy and well, that you would perhaps find some interest in. In addition to being big and broad, we're also fairly bold. And if I haven't given you an indication of that, hopefully already with the various sections, let me introduce you to some of the principles by which we operate. So again, in 2016, when we took on this gig as co-editor, editor-in-chief of the journal, we thought it would be very important to think about the way in which we would bring values to the journal. And so you can see that we are led, deeply by our respect for authors and author voice, for reviewers, that we very much work with the section editors as a team, that we wish to enhance the pluralist intellectual traditions of the journal, use a variety of different formats to inspire conversations that would make a difference in the world, that we're very concerned with the integrity of the publication process from submission through to publication, and that we seek to diversify scholarship as much as possible in varying modes, whether that be gender, race, ethnicity, or geography. So just a bit of a sample of our bold editors who aren't with us here today. We've got some terrific editors, some of whom you'd be very familiar with. And again, this is really just a sample. But I particularly wanted to draw your attention to the last of the editors, or the last of the sections here, because it's our most recently open section. We now have a section on environment and business ethics that Stefan Bohm is editing for us. And a little bit of an ad, he did run a launch session on the journal on May the 28th, And there is a video available. If you've got any difficulties finding it, please do send an email to me or to Stefan or to Gazi, and one of us can send you a link to the video if you're particularly interested in that section. So I think that that's pretty much all I wanted to say as introduction today. As I said, we deliberately kept the introduction or the sort of technical, the descriptive details of the journal quite brief, because we really want to give an opportunity for our editors to speak and for you to ask questions. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Gazi, who is going to facilitate some questions and some discussion amongst the panel.
Great. Thank you very much, Michelle, and many thanks to all of our audience who's spending their afternoon or their morning or night, depending on where you are with us, to hear a bit about our journal and our perspectives on critical management studies and business ethics. So we're really happy to be here with you today. And in keeping with the notion of breadth and the plurality that this journal represents, we decided to make this session interactive. And so I'll be facilitating rather than presenting, and I'll be starting with some questions to some of our section editors. But we also want to hear your questions. So I would like to ask if you have questions that you would like to pose to me or to the section editors, please put them in the Q&A. I'll be working through the questions that I brought prepared, but I'm very happy also to kind of pivot back and forth between your questions and my prepared questions so we can have as interactive a session as possible. I should maybe say to begin with, for me, this interface between CMS and business ethics is particularly interesting because I think both fields are bringing forth a whole series of issues which somehow touch both fields, but in ways that they take a bit of reflection to think whether a certain issue which is in critical management studies would also be in business ethics and vice versa. What would be the criteria on which they would be or wouldn't be, and how exactly should we think about the interface between these fields? So I want to start out by kind of just sort of picking the brains of the different section editors to see about these kind of issues. So what I'm going to ask first, maybe we can go in a certain order and then we can switch the order just so that the first person doesn't get the first pick on the best answers. So maybe if we can start with Charlotte and then Premilla, then Sara, then Suhaib to begin with. Maybe after a brief introduction also just to kind of say who you are and sort of your history with the section. If you could answer the first question, which is, how do you see the relation between critical scholarship and business ethics, particularly as regards your section, right? So what is that interface and how does it pertain to your section? So if we could start with Charlotte.
Sure thing. Thank you so much, Gazi, and also Michelle. It's really great to be here today. I really, well, first of all, I should introduce myself. My name is Charlotte Karam. I am a professor at the American University of Beirut at the Allianz School of Business. And I do research around corporate social responsibility and also feminist models or inclusive models of human resource management. Really excited to speak about this section. The section that I'm responsible for is Feminisms and Business Ethics. And in speaking to Gazi's question about the relationship between critical scholarship and business ethics vis-a-vis the section itself, I see a very, very close relationship. Manuscripts that adopt a critical lens are very, very much welcome within this section. So, for example, we receive a lot of different types of manuscripts that would really draw upon that relationship between critical scholarship and business ethics. So anything from the examination of ethical dimensions of political, social, and cultural interests in the context of business and management, or that, for example, would incorporate the examination of ethics of embedded power relations in business and management, or perpetuation of inequalities or hierarchies. These are all very good animating questions and a good fit. Manuscripts that are uncritical aren't quite a good fit. So I would answer the question by saying that a very core animating characteristic of articles for this section are very much critical. A common mistake is that manuscripts that get submitted to the feminist section often just use women or gender as a demographic category and do not adopt an uncritical examination, that do not try to unpack various power dimensions or do not adopt a critical lens. They're not a good fit. And so we often redirect them to other sections. The final thing I'll say about the importance of or this relationship is that what's very important for the feminist section is scholars think about the ways in which their critical scholarship could lead to possibilities for changing models of business ethics, for creating conditions of progressive change, social transformation, and so on. So I'll stop there, not to go on too long, but thanks for the question.
Thanks, Charlotte. Great. So that's I think a great insight that all scholarship has some kind of critical element to it, but there are some that might be more appropriate than others. How about then, I said, Premilla?
Thanks, Gazi and Michelle, and also the CMS InTouch team. Happy to be over here. So I'm Premilla D'Cruz. I'm a professor of organizational behavior at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. And with JBE, I'm the section editor, co-editor of labor relations and business ethics. And my research interests include workplace bullying, self and identity at work, technology at work, precarious work, and so on. To answer the question about the link between labor relations and critical perspectives, critical scholarship, well, it's quite a clear and direct relationship, quite honestly, because when we talk about labor relations, we're actually talking about issues around employee well-being, employee rights, employee interests, employee dignity, a whole lot of issues which look to the well-being of workers and employees. And so, there's a very clear fit, because when we talk about CMS, we're talking about issues around emancipation, justice, equality, issues which also deal with empowerment and so on. So the fit is quite clear. But in addition, I think what we're also looking to is having the ethics brought into it. How would you look at an ethical dimension, and how would you then look at putting the ideas together to, again, look at change and bringing about transformation in the same way as Charlotte mentioned. So I think the fit is fairly clear. The other aspect is also methodological, in terms of using post-positivist methodologies in order to understand labor and labor issues, labor relations, or issues around employees and so on. So that's really the link we would be looking for. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks, Premilla. And I think so. We had a first question in a question and response, and I think you actually have already given an answer to that. And that was the question as to whether by business, because it's a journal of business ethics, whether we can expand that to include issues of the labor market more generally. And I think your answer is clearly yes. We can extend that to issues of the labor market more generally. So thank you for your answer. So Sara.
Thank you very much also from me for being here today, and everyone to create this forum for us. I am Louise Muhr, and I am a professor at Copenhagen Business School. My research is I almost want to submit to you, Charlotte, because I'm a professor of human resource management, and the feminist lens is definitely one of my my key theoretical lenses. So that is what I do. I'm also from leadership and from a business school, but yes, business can definitely be interpreted in a much broader perspective. So I'm also very happy to be here because, as it was also said earlier, I also had one of my first publications in Journal of Business Ethics. And back then, I remember I thought I'm never going to get this work published in Journal of Business Ethics because it's way too mainstream for me. So also being here, CMS is my home, so to speak, even though it's difficult to talk about CMSs or non-CMSs, etc. But that is, where I come from. So I originally remember that I thought, okay, Journal of Business Ethics might not be a good fit for me. So when you came to me and asked me, and you asked me to also talk about the history, I don't remember how long it is ago, 4, 5, 6 years, 5 years. I don't remember how many years I've been in this chair. Anyways, so when you asked, I was very, very pleased to take up this position, which is the one associated for the section on critical scholarship or critical work, because that is really something I saw as a possibility for journal of business ethics. And it has also been developed a lot over the last few years. And that's also why the question raised to me, the relation should be blinding obvious, because the section is named Critical Perspectives of Business Ethics. I think that leaves me a somewhat maybe problematic position, because when I hear you talk about your sections, I'm thinking, oh, I published that word too. so I also think that the critical section, you have to correct me, Michelle and Gazi, if that's not correct, but it was one of the first critical sections, or at least directly critical sections, because one of the things I have tried to do over the years, in which I know that Raza, who was before me in this chair, also did, was to try to develop the critical section for not, and excuse me, just being critical theory, which is often some of the theoretical lenses that is associated with CMS, or at least the birth of CMS, or some of the founding fathers it is of CMS. So I'm also trying to broaden the theoretical perspective, also welcoming critical theory, obviously, but also trying to work with post-colonial lens, a feminist lens, also critical labor relations, Foucauldian lens, so other types of critical theoretical perspectives. So in a sense, I have to excuse if I'm colonizing a little on some of the other sections, but I think it's also where we work together and can also help each other in the way that we do, and which also makes Journal of Business Ethics very unique in comparison to other sections, or other journals where there aren't so defined sections. So I think it's also very important to notice that they, of course, overlap each other.
Great, thanks a lot, Sarah. And I think the point you made was really important, that there was an important signaling that came about with regards to the critical section, to show that there is a section that it does welcome critical work, but that should not be interpreted to mean that the other sections would be not critical. Exactly. So there's critical work that runs across many of the sections. And because we have the internal transfer section, it might very well be that a paper that is sent to the critical section might fit better with another. And then Sarah would use her judgment to transfer, depending. Yeah. So there's a kind of dynamic movement between the sections.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I might have a problem giving up the feminist papers, though.
Okay, so shall we go to Suhaib?
Hi, everyone. I'm Suhaib Riaz. I started working on this section, Global Issues. This was created about 3 years ago. Part of the reason this was created is because we wanted to signal that this is not about mainstream international business studies, as we have known, the unquestioning, unreflective, uncritical kinds of studies we see in IB. The idea was to think of issues. And just as a starting thought, if you're thinking of submitting to the section, you want to think about, from a global issues perspective, who, as an individual or as a community, who are the most vulnerable, most marginalized, most targeted people, okay, that sort of relate to your issue. And if you start from there, you will see a lot of interesting ethical issues arising. Okay, the questions will be about, who is responsible there, the organizations that, we are basically an organization journal. So then you want to think about how organizations are implicated in some of those issues and how they're impacted by those issues as well. And those would be some starting thoughts to start bringing critical and global issues together. The one thing I would like to add here is that over the 3 years, I've learned that global issues are sometimes very local and vice versa. So I'm sitting here in Canada. I can give you an example, something that's been in the news. 215 Indigenous children's bodies were discovered fairly recently here in British Columbia. these kids were part of the residential school system that the Canadian system ran for decades. And now, is this a local issue, right? Is this a local issue for the community there or for the people there, that province? Or is it really a global issue? Does it tie into global histories of colonization, dispossession, oppression, and so on? So, you want to start maybe a little bit local, get some depth around what the issue is, but then also tie into global issues. As we speak, I did my PhD at Western, I don't know if you can see this Western mug that I'm holding up. London, Ontario, which is probably an unknown city. Just yesterday, the news came in that there has been an attack on visible minorities. 4 of a family are dead. Now, this is a very local issue. In school, a quiet university town where I did my PhD. But then you start reading the details and you realize that this attack is deeply tied to global narratives of hate and demonization and Islamophobia and other forms of hate as well that are gaining currency. And so that sort of elevates it to a global issue, and the focus on the vulnerable, targeted, and marginalized brings a critical angle. So those would be my starting thoughts here.
Great, thank you, Suhaib. So I guess, as we can see, global issues here doesn't just mean multinational corporations and their international business. There's clearly a much broader attempt to look at the global impacts of business at local levels also. Okay, so I think you can already see the kind of wide span and the way these topics are interacting and are sort of touching each other, but have some distinct aspects. So I was going to go to the second prepared question, but we have a really nice one from the audience that I want to go to first. So this kind of will be a surprise question for the panelists. And maybe if we can go in the opposite order this time. So we start with Suhaib and go backwards. So this question is from Matthias, who is actually, I can maybe give it away, is our editor for the psychology section, which is another section which wasn't mentioned earlier that has a strong openness to critical work, right? So it's really nice to see you here, Matthias. I'm glad that you could pose a question. So the question is, what is the ideal balance between critique in a paper and the development of alternatives or the imagination of possibilities? So here, I guess the way I'm interpreting that is the sort of negative kind of critique of the denunciating part and the idea of imagination and alternative possibilities. And so if you could say something about that, maybe starting from Suhaib.
I love the question. I think it's a very important question. I don't think I can really answer it though, but I can throw out some hints. And I don't want to give you a sense that there is some sort of ideal balance in this sort of measure that we are doing here. But I do want to respect the idea in the question that there has to be more than critique. And I think this ties into a long history of where critical studies and critical theory have gone over the years, over the decades, which is we have actually moved away from action. And you see this conversation not just in critical management studies, but actually in the core disciplines. So if you look at sociology, I think a book just came out called Critique and Praxis, where Hankert is the name. I can share more if somebody needs it. The book is essentially about this, how over the years we have lost this balance, so to speak, and the critical perspectives have been confined to the ivory towers with very little action on the ground. And so there is this attempt to bring more praxis back and get us involved. So yeah, I mean, I would love to see some of that. I would love to see the alternatives in a submission along with the critique. At the same time, I don't want to say that it is a requirement. If you're doing some of both or some of one, that would still be an interesting submission in itself.
Great. Sara?
I love this question. Thank you so much. I think I have 3 areas I would like to touch upon. And the first is, I think for me, it's very important that it's not critique for the sake of critique. So it's not so much the percentage of critique, versus alternatives, but more, you know, I think there has been a tradition in, and I think it's also what you try to allude to, so this critique for the sake of critique, or the lack of self-critique in critical work. So I think for me, the first thing I would do is to evaluate whether it is a reflexive critical voice, and whether the critique is for the sake of critique. Because, and now I might provoke some people, but critique is easy. So taking a critical standpoint is easy, especially if you're criticizing, you know, something systemic or a system, because I mean, all of us in a sense can do that. Producing alternatives is much more difficult, because you also end up being a victim of your own critique, because a lot of critical work is also critical towards solutions, which means producing alternatives can also be problematic in and on itself. So I think maybe it's not so much alternatives, but it's a reflexive addressing the so what question. So a critical analysis without a reflection of the so what question is problematic for me, but not necessarily alternatives. Although, I mean, I would also love to see alternatives, but sometimes that's not possible. So I think it's also good enough to address the so what question and reflect critically over the possibility, or maybe the impossibility, of alternatives. And then I think the third point I want to, I didn't mention the second, but the third point I wanted to also mention is self-critique. And maybe I also hit a nerve here in CMS and my own community, that there has been, I think, at least a lack of self-critique in the community. So often the most critical people are the ones that don't see what they themselves can be, you know, objects of critique from. So I think something I also look for in my papers is a form of self-critique towards the critical standpoint, if that makes sense.
Okay, great. Premilla?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think I'll take forward what Sara mentioned, because it's quite true that, you know, critique for its own sake is not very helpful. But I would imagine, or the way one looks at a paper is the way you actually develop it. So I think it's the idea you come with and the message you want. And, you know, within that, you kind of build up a critique such that you're kind of indicating, okay, what's going on over here? What are the issues around this particular phenomenon or this particular situation which needs to be addressed? And so, you know, in actually developing the critique in a way, you are also showing not just what the issue is or what the problem is, but showing ways in which you could try to, you know, improve it. So I think, you know, develop the kind of standpoint with which you begin and you undertake the critique kind of should have an inbuilt component of something that's constructive and something that leads to you know, a better way ahead. And then I think depending on how you've conceptualized your paper, you may have a fair amount of real possibilities, you know, that you put across, you know, what can actually be done or how can it feed into praxis. So I think the whole issue here is, what are you conceptualizing your paper or your central message to be, and how are you developing it? And within that, how do you make the critique not just a critique for critique's sake, and how much do you put towards praxis and actual, you know, very concrete or actionable kind of ways ahead? So that would be my view on this particular matter. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Charlotte?
I mean, I agree with everything my colleagues said, and I would say that in the feminisms section, it's the balance actually goes towards imagination of the alternatives and the possibilities. A feminist approach to the business ethics questions are to lead towards the creation of alternatives, possibilities for changing, and, you know, progressive change. So feminist praxis, and if there's no part of the paper that's generative towards social justice and change and ways of improving the dignity and well-being of vulnerable communities and marginalized communities, then to me personally, and the way that we're building the section, then is it really feminist? Is it really contributing to feminist models of business ethics? And so for me, it's a very important question, and I would lean the balance towards the second end.
Great. Thanks, Charlotte. And I think that maybe just to quickly hook on the last point you said, I think it might be also because we have so many different sections that the relation between the kind of negative aspect of critique, the denunciatory or the revelatory aspect of critique, and this imagination of alternatives, this might work out differently from section to section. It might also have to do with the stage. How much has something been already kind of critiqued to death and we already know, and now what? Or are we in a situation where there's still kind of hegemonic beliefs about something, and that's revealing or unveiling is actually really important. And that might change from topic to topic. So I would say that there are many discussions happening, and both are important and valuable aspects. Okay, I want to go to the next question I had prepared, but there was an issue, and it is repeated a couple of times in one version and another, and I want to address it before we go on. A couple of our participants have asked about the choice of section. So one participant asked, is it only possible to write for one section for submission? Some papers might potentially straddle more or one sections. Another one asks a question about section choice when publishing a paper, how to choose between two sections when a paper seems to fit both. I think there are a few people who have voiced this concern, and it's quite a common concern with our journal. If a paper does seem to fit one or the other sections, what to do, how to pick one. And I might mention just very quickly, because we have talked about sections, but one thing that we maybe need to emphasize is that regardless of the section, all of the decisions that are made in all of the sections pertain to Journal of Business Ethics as a whole. So all of the papers are assessed whether they make a contribution to or within the scope of the Journal of Business Ethics. And all of the editors make that decision as their final decision. So you might want to think of the section as a kind of portal to that wider decision, but it's ultimately not the section that is sort of choosing whether it's there's a fitting or not the section, it's fitting or not the journal. But nevertheless, there is an important question there about if, for example, there's a critical paper that also fits feminism and is maybe about a global issue, how would you choose? How would you choose? And maybe instead of going one by one, maybe if we can just kind of open up and just have a couple of minutes of discussion, if you have, right, because we can maybe just get some different views on that. Does anyone want to jump on that question? Yeah, Sarah.
Yes, I actually wanted to before you asked, so thank you for that. I think that a helpful frame of viewing that questions within is it works the same way in other journals. It's just not as visible. So in other journals, there will be associate editors where they all have their areas of expertise. It's just not advertised as such. So I think that you also said, Gazi, it's not like we publish this issue is in this section, this issue is the other section, but that it's more a matter of visibility to see what editors could my work end up at. As I usually also encourage my junior scholars in my department that when you submit to any other journal, then you might actually look at the associate editors and look who your work might fit the best with, and write a letter to the editor-in-chief saying, I think that this submission would be beneficial if it were handled by ABC because of the theoretical fit. So I think that we just do what other journals do behind the scenes, so to speak, that we do it more explicitly and more openly, if that's okay to phrase it like that.
For sure, yeah.
I might address the more technical side of that, and that is the part of the question was, is it possible to choose two sections when submitting a paper? So in terms of identifying your paper in a particular way, there we have a keyword classification system, and you can certainly choose keywords from across any of the sections. But in terms of submitting to more than one section, that's just not literally physically possible, because the paper will end up in the account of and in the hands of a handling editor. And so ultimately the section that you choose, or if there is an internal transfer, will determine that. So there can only be the one person, and you've got an embarrassment of riches. I'm so pleased that you're going to have this really tough question of having to choose between these fantastic handling editors. But that is the situation for the paper cannot be with more than one editor, but it can certainly identify itself in more than one way.
Yeah, and it is also maybe worth saying that, you know, in many other journals, you might tacitly hope that a certain associate editor might handle that paper because it seems to fit kind of like the literature that they've been involved with. And in JBE, the author directly chooses that, so it doesn't go through the filter of the editor-in-chief first. So that does give a lot more autonomy to the author. So I would see that as definitely a positive thing. Yeah. Are there any other thoughts on the different section editor? Okay, so then why don't I go to the next question? So this is a little bit of the inverse of the first question, but more like looking at what are the differences between some critical work and business ethics. So the question is, what is the relation between critical work that is not suitable for the journal and critical work that is? So I think that might be a little bit more of a difficult question, and maybe could generate also some debate, but maybe we start with Charlotte, Premilla, Sara, and Suhaib, like we first did. So Charlotte.
Yes, thank you. So for me, within the section, the feminisms section, what I often see when critical work comes in is sometimes they don't really engage with the ethics or the business ethics of the questions being asked. And I see that Max Visser asked the question, or a related question in the chat. But speaking to my section, what we're looking for is feminist approaches to the ethical analysis of business, or ethical analysis of feminist approaches to business. So in effect, like what manuscript, a good fit would be what manuscripts illuminate the potential of exploring feminist foundations to business ethics specifically, or facilitating both the business of feminist frameworks of business ethics, and as importantly, challenging the very assumptions of whether or not feminist business ethics is possible, or is the agenda of feminism or feminisms or various forms of feminisms to unpack business. And so what are the sort of ethical dimensions and some of the ethical dilemmas that come out there? So what is not suitable, just to repeat in a more succinct way for the journal, is those manuscripts that don't really talk about business or business ethics, or the combination of the two.
Okay, great. Yeah, so at some point the ethical part has to come out from within the critical work and really be made explicit. Okay, great. Premilla?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I would say that we would look for, first of all, I think one would look for papers, within the papers, they should have both the ethical and the emancipatory aspects. You know, that's something that one would look for first. And then the other part is, you know, I would use an example to kind of try and answer this question about what would we look for. So it's, you know, if you look at just critiquing something, for example, you look at a performance management system and you're just critiquing it in terms of, okay, how could you strengthen it? And if you're talking about strengthening it in order to, you know, increase controls, and those controls tend to be more exploitative. Now that's not the critique you're looking for. You're looking for, okay, the strengthening, you know, you're looking at critiquing a performance management system to look at how it could be probably more, you know, give workers or employees more autonomy, or make the work more meaningful for them, and things like that. You know, and in that sense, you know, the critique, therefore, when you look at critique, it's like looking at, okay, does the critique move towards, you know, emancipation, or does it not? And that would be something which would help you to say, okay, what would we publish or not publish, and how does the ethics fit in with that? So I hope the examples kind of help. It's a bit of a tricky thing, but one has to keep asking oneself this question in terms of where is, you know, the critique leading to? Is it just empty, or is it something that would have a potential to improve, you know, either ethical functioning, or, you know, the conditions of work for employees and things like that? So that's where the answer would lie. Thank you.
Great. Sara?
I honestly don't think I have much to add. I think it's both what Charlotte and Premilla emphasized. I can maybe say that the main reason for not accepting the critical work that's submitted to my section, because I don't get much non-critical work submitted, is the lack of ethics, as you also put out very succinctly at the end, Charlotte. I mean, that is the most kind of used cause.
Okay. When you say the lack of ethics, do you mean that it's not stated, or it's just not there?
Yeah, and okay, maybe I should reflect a little bit more about that, because there can be an ethical dimension which is not explicit, So actually, now that you push me a little on that, yeah, so not so much that it's not stated, but that it's not dealing with an ethical issue, something of ethical or morally concern, but that can be phrased differently, and I can't think of an example on the spot. So it doesn't have to, I can also see if it's just name dropping. So I can also see if it's not fitting, and then the word ethics is just put in a few references a little randomly. I mean, then it also becomes, quite obvious. So it's not the explicitity of the question, but more does it fundamentally, I think also what Charlotte said, fundamentally deal with a fundamentally ethical issue.
Great. Suhaib?
Yes, I mean, I agree with everything that was said. I was also thinking along the lines of Sara that, I receive a lot of submissions where I feel the ethics issues are implicit. So if you're studying, marginalized people who've been at the receiving end of a problematic organization, that itself, it's rich with potential ethics issues. All you have to do is elevate the ethics tensions and the ethics puzzle there and say, who's responsible? What should be done? Where, is this a question of local elites, global elites, wider, global narratives that we have allowed to flourish and so on? So raise it as an ethics puzzle, and then that would be a better fit. And I agree with Sara that, again, it's not a question of just signaling and throwing in a few ethics words, but you want to actually describe and elevate that tension or that puzzle in detail, engage with ethics literatures in some details, and that'll be good.
Okay, great. I might just say a very quick word on that too, before we move to one of the questions from the audience. For me, I think this is really one of the key issues that I've struggled with the most, just conceptually, because on the one hand, it seems to me that critical work almost always, almost by definition, has some kind of a normative or some kind of an ethical kind of force to it that you sort of feel even if you don't use the word ethics. So I felt there was a sort of natural confluence between these two areas. But then when you read a lot of critical theory, you often hear people oppose the ethical, for example, to the political or to the social, and as if the ethical is some kind of a reduction or some kind of depolitization of, and so there's that way of using ethics which seems to take it out of the critical. And I think maybe what we're saying here is that confluence between the two terms is something that we really want to hold on to. You shouldn't be interpreting business ethics as opposed to business politics or opposed to business and society. That is definitely the overlap in the bringing together of those two things. And I think the editorial that we recently published that Michelle said is really trying to get at that bringing together. There's a question in the audience that I think it's actually there are two and they're related, and I think probably Suhaib would be the natural respondent to this, but we could also see what other people say. One of them was asking directly to Suhaib if he has a recommended paper of his choice where you start from the local and connected it with a more global issue. So maybe a bit more clarity on that, if there's an example you might cite. And just so let you think for a moment about that, I'll say that the next question was specifically about Africa. So how receptive is JBE to critical issues of Africa, which have multifaceted dimensions of ethics and social justice? For example, hierarchies, marginalization, gender disadvantages against women, unsustainable corporate practices. So do we have a particular section to handle African critical nuances? So maybe we start with that easier question first about the example, and then we can open up the question around Africa and we can discuss it more broadly. If that's okay, Suhaib.
Sure, I think, again, great questions. So I don't want to, give you just one example and sort of, narrow us down to a silo, but I can give you some example. The first one that came to my mind is a paper that we published on Nigerian netizens. And this actually also speaks to the second question a little bit. Now, these were netizens, around the issue of corruption and trust in Nigeria. At one level, it was a very local issue. And it was a very descriptive issue initially. There was not much of an ethics and theoretical puzzle, but over time, the paper developed and became, a global issues and ethics paper. So that would be one example. Another example, more recent one I can give you, is one of extrajudicial police killings in India. This can be seen as a very local issue. It was tied into local politics, the rise of the right wing in India, for example, and this is very sort of geographically confined at first glance. But then when you look at it, I have known scholars who have done similar work in Brazil, for example, and there is police complicity and so on, and the power of the oppressors over the marginalized. These are very global sort of issues, and so you can see that paper then elevates it, makes it an ethics issue, and makes it a theoretical issue, brings in Derrida as the philosophical lens, excuse me. So those are some examples that I would say. A very sort of unique one was, there was this issue around Brazilian meat processors and some ethics issues that were raised there around animal welfare. Now again, first glance you would think, hey, this is very local, but then they tied it into global value chains and how ethics issues are raised, and in notions of global South and global North and so on. So I think it's easy to do. It's easy to elevate those. I would add just a quick thought for the second question, that I'm certainly very receptive to papers that deal with issues in Africa. Generally, the way I try to handle any geographic region where I may have somewhat less expertise is we try to find reviewers who have very good expertise in that. We have a lot of such reviewers in our editorial board and beyond in our network. So that's typically how we would handle that, and we're very welcoming of such papers.
Yeah, that's a very nice point, Suhaib, that probably the first thing an editor is going to do if they get to a very specific geographical phenomenon is to try to see if there are other academics who would have knowledge of that phenomena, that context, that they could also ask as at least one of the reviewers. Can I ask maybe the group as a whole to speak to the issue of Africa, if you've had experience with that or thoughts about that?
I mean, I could take not necessarily specifically about Africa, but the idea of being open to more contextualized analysis of various questions that are fit for JBE. I think JBE actually is one of the journals that, in previous reviews, critical reviews of literature in various areas, you see that JBE is actually quite open to, and more open than many other journals, to publishing or considering publications from around the world, and a large portion, I did a review, I think in 2018 on CSR. And in fact, JBE was the #1 publisher on articles on CSR that focused in the global South. But I think that what's really important is that the idea of at least for me in my section, and I think when I was previously a section editor in the HRM and HRD section at JBE before I assumed this role, context is very, very important, and beginning to, receive more articles from the Global South, from Africa, from the Middle East, from South America, and so on, is extremely important. And that we do take great care in selecting, just to repeat what Suhaib said, great care in selecting editors that are going to be or reviewers that are going to be conscientious of contextual nuances and the need to theorize those contextual nuances that in a way that can contribute to business ethics and various models of ethics. So that's all I would add to there.
Okay, Premilla?
Yeah, I just wanted to, add to both of the questions, because we had in our section also a very interesting paper which came out recently in February, which was, in a way, I mean, it had many complex strains to it. So it really was local and brought to a global stage, and it done very well indeed. So it's a paper that talked about the writings of Ambedkar, so it was situated within the issue of inequality and diversity and inclusion in the workplace, which is a very important topic. And within that, that, they talked about how the literature is so westernized and it's important to have a non-Western context. But even within the non-Western context, what they did was they brought in a more subaltern perspective. So they used India, and within that they used caste, and they used the writings of Ambedkar, so a very important social theorist who's not been given that much of importance, or not, who's been neglected in a way. And what they did, and this paper was really unique because what they did, and it answers many of the questions that have come up, what was done was they referred to the writings of Ambedkar, and they talked about how he's, understood caste as a larger social and economic phenomenon, so caste and labor, and then how the institutionalized roots of caste actually play out to impinge on issues of equality within a workplace, and what can be done about it. So in a way, because they located it within inequalities and within diversity and inclusion, it had a big global relevance, and they brought that out as well. They brought in the ethical aspect more with the constructive part of it. So they critique the lack of, literature on this topic. Then they refer to Ambedkar, and they talk about his offerings of, persuasive ethics and, reaching modes rather than confrontational modes, etc. And so they that's why I said that it's the way you conceptualize a paper. If you decide to have a critique and the constructive part of action, and you bring that out, and then you also, make it generalizable in a way. It's very, very local, and within the local, it's also very subaltern, and yet you bring it up. That's really a very good example of a paper that straddles so many levels as well as both action and critique. So I just wanted to share that. And the other thing is, I think our section and JB in general, I think Michelle talked about it, is very inclusive. I think we are, interested in having more voices, both from the global South as well as in terms of, like for our section, issues on more cutting edge areas like technology and work, precarity and work, or, workers which have, or workforces that have been really not focused on, people engaged in highly dirty forms of work, for example, Black kinds of work, etc. So I think there's a lot of openness also to methodological innovation. So I think the journal is a good platform.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I might also mention a recent paper by Naude in 2019 on Ubuntu and decoloniality, which I think also addresses some of the issues that might be relevant here. I'm quite aware of the time, and we're running relatively low on time. So maybe I see Sara has her hand up. So why don't we take this question, and then we'll do a kind of general wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think it's a question that I deal with a lot, not just in my section, but generally. And I think there are two aspects here, and one is context. So where are the studies conducted? Also, who conducts the studies? And then I think there's a theoretical lens. And I think in both instances, we have to be very careful, particularly myself as a white person, have to be very careful of contextualizing more the cases that comes from the global South, as if Denmark, for example, is not a context. So I also think that, critical examinations from a colonial perspective of a Danish context, for example, is very, very relevant. So, but back to the papers that we get submitted, I get lots of work submitted from various areas of the world. And as Suhaib also said, we have a very broad range of reviewers. So it's very important for me also to choose reviewers not from a Western, which is also a construction context, but that is also the case when it's a paper submitted from a British university or from a German university. So I think that it's also important that we bring in the multitude of voices, not just when it's an other case, so that we reproduce that othering of certain cases and not others. So I think it's a super complex question, and you said we were wrapping up. So if I'm opening a whole new area of discussion, I'm sorry, but I think it's a very, very important question to raise, not just with cases from Africa or India, but generally.
Yeah, thank you for opening up the issue. It gives us things to think about also after. I think Michelle had a comment to make on one of the questions, and then I'll go ahead and wrap up.
Classic unmute. Yes, so I know I just noticed a question that asked, it stated most early career researchers from Global South are able to find empirical information data related to ethics, but struggle with theoretical contribution. Do you have any suggestions, please? So I'd be very interested to hear what the panel said. I'm not quite sure whether we're needing to finish because we are close to the hour, or even over it. But one section that we haven't drawn your attention to, and that is we have a practice and business ethics section. And that section is really hoping to foreground exciting empirical settings and lived experience of practitioners and business people on the ground. And so it could be that if you have a setting that's particularly important, particularly unique, and you don't want to focus so much on theory, that you should have a look at the practice and business ethics section. The other thing that I would mention very briefly is that we do have an internal referral system to a developmental editor, and our developmental editor is Scott Taylor. And so for a paper that we feel that we would like to really work with, and perhaps we're concerned it wouldn't survive a more traditional review system, we have an internal referral system, so the author cannot access directly, but any one of the editors that you've met here today, or any of the editors of the journal, can refer a paper on to our developmental editor. So just a couple of other aspects. So this comes back to my comments to begin with. These are the advantages of being big, of being really broad and having such an incredibly talented editorial team, and of trying to be a little bit unconventional and taking on the role of being a little bit more bold than perhaps some of the other more embedded business journals are. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I'll pass back to you. Oh no, Sarah's got a hand. I'll pass Gazi if you'd like to.
Yeah, go ahead, Sara.
Just very quickly, because I also think it's important to notice that we have the revise before review option. And at least I've used that a couple of times with work that is definitely from a junior scholar, where the idea is really good, but either lacks some theoretical framing or some other aspects where I, as a reviewer, can give some advice to how I think the paper will better survive a review process. And I've just recently accepted a paper that's been through a pretty long process. And I know sometimes you tell me it shouldn't have too many reviews, but it's been a pretty long process, which started by the reject before review and has turned into a wonderful paper by a junior scholar. So I think that option is also quite unique for our journal.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to start wrapping up the discussion, but I want to thank everyone for having also really focused on some of the deeper conceptual issues, kind of digging into the points of contact between business ethics and critical management studies. So we didn't really focus our discussion so much on the nuts and bolts of the, we didn't talk about impact factors. We didn't talk about the time to publication. We wanted to stick to kind of more conceptual issues because I think it's more interesting. But there are some small issues that might be interesting as well. Michelle mentioned the practice section. I also want to mention there was somebody in the audience who asked about the book review section, which we now call books and more. So we have put that in parentheses to emphasize that our book review section is openly welcoming reviews of things other than books, for example, film, other popular culture. So you can be creative with our books and more review section, and that's something we very much welcome. So when it comes to kind of finer details about the specific sections, all of those descriptions are on the website. But I feel like we could go on for a very long time, but I don't want to run over the time of the very generous allocation of the CMS InTouch people. So are there any other final comments before we close up? Suhaib?
The one thing I want to add, throughout we have been talking in the role of editors, but I want to remind all of us, the participants here, that we are all one community here, and you have to challenge us as well. You are also actively shaping these sections, and you're actively shaping the journal through your submissions. There may be many things that we have overlooked here that, you know, if I'm thinking about global issue, there may be something you're thinking of as a global issue that maybe I'm not. So convince us, push us, expand the scope and think of it as a community. That would be my final comment.
Great, thank you, Suhaib. So now I'll pass to Vijatya, and who I think will take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gazi. Thank you for the fantastic, lively and interactive session. It was really great to see so much of encouragement for critical work from Journal of Business Ethics team. And I'm sure many of us would like to engage, or rather engage more with the journal as authors or reviewers. Many thanks to all the attendees for an active participation and great questions. And with that, we come to the end of the webinar. I would like to thank the CMS InTouch members behind the scenes, Alex, Kat, Arturo, Ozan, for their tremendous support. And we would like to draw your attention to our forthcoming events. So in July, we have publishing critical work in organizational studies. In October, we'll have publishing critical work in culture and organization. We encourage you to register yourself for these events. And you can also subscribe to our Eventbrite page. With that, you'll be able to receive notifications of our forthcoming events. And in case you've missed any of our past events, or maybe you'd like to revisit them, you could do so in our YouTube channel. We are on Twitter as well. You could follow us there too. And in case you would like to conduct your own webinar, you're more than welcome to write to us on cmswebinar@gmail.com. So thank you so much. That's all for now. Take care and stay safe. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye-bye.